Hey guys, what's up? It's Alec Torelli. Today I'm bringing you a short video about my thoughts on the 2016 World Series of Poker final table. First off, I'd like to start by saying I'm really impressed with the balance of analysis and entertainment that all the announcers did. From Norman, Chad, Lon McCarran, Antonio in the main booth announcing in real time. That was incredible. I've had experience announcing this way on Twitch and many other poker formats, streaming live myself, even doing these hand of the day videos. A lot of experience analyzing poker hands, especially in real time. And I'm really impressed with how well they did and how much energy they put out, even in the midst of a session going 5, 6, 7 hours. It's really impressive. It's very hard to stay focused. You basically have to do more than the players sometimes because you have to analyze every single hand and you have to eloquate your thoughts, whereas sometimes when you're playing you could just do that in your head. So very impressed with the announcers. They did an excellent job. Hats off. I'm also impressed with, I like the balance between Daniel and Phil Hellmuth, their banter about disagreeing a lot of times on hands, where Daniel's a little more analytical, Phil's a little more a feel type of player, and his analysis was really funny and entertaining and insightful, the back and forth between them. And of course Kara Scott, excellent job as well. So I was really impressed with the announcing. It was run very well and all that was great. Now I'd like to talk about the strategy, some of my thoughts on the different players, and Qui Nguyen especially, of course, the big talk of the town, and whether or not he's good for poker, things of that nature. So first, the final table. I'm impressed with the level of play. I think even amongst players that didn't describe themselves as professionals or that didn't play full time, I was still really impressed with the level of play. I didn't feel like there were that many big mistakes being made. Of course, there's some small mistakes here and there, like maybe betting is better than checking, or maybe bet sizing mistakes are probably the most common that you see at the final table. But all in all, I was very impressed with the level of play. I think even watching the final table, where it's presumably one of the easiest tournaments of the year, you could see that even at that event, the level of play has elevated dramatically if you watch final table 7 years ago. So it's pretty impressive to see. And this isn't even a super high roller where the best pros in the world are likely to make the final table. This is just a sample of 7,000 random poker players, some of which are the best in the world, but a lot of which are some of the worst players that enter these tournaments. And to see that represented here at the final table was very impressive to me. I'd first like to talk about Ruzicka. And, well, first off, I'm going to be making a lot of hand of the day videos about hands at the final table. So I'm not going to talk too much about specific hands and strategy here, but just their overall play in general. It was really interesting to me to watch a player like Ruzicka who just absolutely went for it in every spot. Ruzicka played that final table like you would expect someone to play a 1-2 cash game. And I don't mean that he was spewy, not at all, but just his fearlessness and confidence was extremely impressive to me. So that's a characteristic I'd like to highlight in Ruzicka, and it was really impressive. Like, there were spots where people can say, oh yeah, it's easy, this is the correct play here, but knowing what the correct play is, or knowing what you maybe should do, and having the balls to execute when there's 8 million on the line, and if you're wrong, you get $1 million, that is incredibly impressive. And Ruzicka was 100% fifth gear every time he needed to be, and in all the close spots, he went for it. I'd like to talk a little bit about the sort of some of the results-oriented thinking that I found in some of the Twitter stream. For those of you who don't know, I did live Twitter updates about every single hand at the final table. So every single hand, I would just do World Series of Poker hashtag and comment on what I thought the play would be, kind of like a digital sort of commentary. And I was really active on the Twitter stream, and I saw a lot of the comments going back and forth, and I feel like a lot of the sentiment towards some of the plays were based on the results. Classically, Ruzicka's big bluff that he made where he got caught bluffing and Veo had a set and he busted. Daniel Negreanu made a great point on TV that, if Ruzicka is right here and Veo folds top pair, he's going to be a hero. And he might go on to win that tournament and everyone talk about he's the greatest player of all time. And then, he gets caught bluffing and loses and, he's forgotten and maybe he's like a blow-up spewy guy and made a mistake. So I would like to first acknowledge just like how much variance there is in poker, and when you see a sample of 200 hands at the final table of the World Series, it's like, the best player doesn't always win, or the best situation doesn't always come up for that player to shine, and there is variance involved, and sometimes, you know, Ruzicka's on the bad end of it. His opponent had a set, and he went bust. So I was impressed with his play overall, and you know, don't try to resist the urge to be too biased about the end results dictating whether or not a play was good or not, or whether or not, you know, there was merit in the situation. Second player I'd like to highlight was Josephine, and I thought he did a great job as well. I was pulling for him in different spots. I guess I wasn't rooting for any one player in particular. I was sort of just rooting for someone to stand out and then that player to win. I'm pretty impartial unless I have a piece of someone or someone's like my best friend or whatever. I'm pretty impartial to who wins, whether it's in sports or the World Series or whatever. I just like to see exception rise to the top and that to deserve to win. I thought Josephine had a very solid plan with a good mixture of aggression, but also well-timed patience. He got into an unfortunate spot with Veo where they went set over set, and that hand will make the hand of the day for sure, so I'll talk more about the strategy in that hand later. But I also thought he'd be a really good ambassador for poker. He's done a lot for the poker world, and it would have been cool to see him win as well. Lastly, I'd like to talk about, well, not lastly, I'd like to talk about Veo and Nguyen, and then whether or not Nguyen is good for poker. So Veo and Nguyen heads up is a great dichotomy for the public to see two completely different playing styles, two completely different types of players, and just two completely different approaches going at it heads up, and these two things collide, and you know, you could see how one style tries to balance out the other with the complete opposite strategy. So I thought it was brilliant to watch, and I was excited that these two guys went heads up because arguably of anyone at the final table, they were the most extreme, right? And Nguyen was by far the most aggressive, and Veo was by far the most conservative, right? Veo made maybe some, you know, the mistakes that Nguyen made were because he was too aggressive when he got carried away, and the mistakes that Veo made were because he was too passive and didn't show enough heart in big spots, right? He wasn't competing for enough pots. So I thought it was really interesting to see that of the spectrum here, you have the one player here and the other player here, and you could sort of see how they like try and combat each other and meet in the middle. I thought it was brilliant. Some of the things that I thought Veo did very well were as the heads-up match progressed, he tried to take a more balanced approach and limp in, check a lot of flops, keep the pot small, and wait for Nguyen to get over-aggressive and make a big mistake. So even though Veo might have consciously been aware that he wasn't winning more than 50% of pots, he felt like he was probably going to compensate by that from that by winning the biggest 50% of pots. So the big pots he was going to win, where he was going to lose more of the small pots, but his strategy was clearly like, keep the pot small, let Nguyen make a huge bluff, and just call him down when I have something. So I was impressed with his strategy that was completely counterbalancing to Nguyen, and how he tried to leverage that against a player that was really aggressive, right? He wasn't trying to combat aggression with aggression because Nguyen was just too good at that style. So I was impressed with Veo from that manner. What I would like to see more of from Veo were a little bit more of the fearlessness and heart that I think you need to actually come in first place. So I think he relied a little bit too much on the cards just allowing him to get there, right? He had two sets where he doubled up, and I mean, relying on doubling up with two sets to win the main event is just not a strategy that could win in the long run. I mean, he was fortunate to get there. I would like to see how he would have played if he didn't make those two sets, but I fear that he might have just kind of like blinded away and waited for a big spot and maybe just got down to 20 or 30 big blinds and busted in fourth. When he got heads up, I would have also liked to see a little bit more heart in making some big calls, or maybe making one or two big bluffs, or using his image to win some pots. I think he was a little timid to make bluffs against Nguyen, but honestly I think that after a while he built up this image for 3 days over the final table, and I think he could have got away with, you know, a river check raise or two, or a turn check raise or something like that, where Nguyen might have laid down a big hand. Just because Nguyen is kind of hyper aggressive and a little crazy on the crazy side at times doesn't mean he isn't capable of making a big fold or waiting for a better spot. If he sees the tightest player at the table make a huge move and that guy has it every single time, I think Veo could have used that to his advantage and made one or two big moves to keep his chip stack up or even, and, you know, leverage some of the time that he wasn't getting big hands or just getting outdrawn. Nguyen, on the other hand, was extremely aggressive and frankly pretty damn impressive. Like, I think knowing that he had a skill disadvantage or experience disadvantage from the pros, I think he did a great job of adapting by playing a style that wasn't trying to beat the pros with their own game. If Nguyen went into the final table and tried to play like Veo or like Josephie or like Ruan, just really solid and hand read better than the other players or whatever, he wouldn't have been able to compete because, you know, the other players have more experience doing that. Veo's getting coaching by some of the best players in the world, and he's been a pro for 10 years. Nguyen's not going to match Veo in terms of that experience, so he has to do the complete opposite and throw him for a loop and play the game on his terms. To his credit, he never changed his approach. He just kept going with his game plan. He was fearless in every single pot, and every single time that, you know, he had the decision between going for it or being a little passive, he went for it because he knew that was his game plan and he stuck to it, and it paid off for him. So I'm really impressed with him. He had a ton of heart, and even though at times he did cross the line, to be fair, you know, you can't know where the line is until you cross it. So of course he crossed it a few times, being a little too aggressive, bluffing off in spots that weren't great. But in the long run, he used that to his advantage, applied max pressure on his opponents, and ultimately took advantage of spots where other people were just scared or too timid to, or were waiting to move up in pay jump. So I was really impressed with Nguyen, and frankly, at the end, I thought he deserved it. He did well. So I think that what's interesting is how Veo should approach combating a player that's super hyper aggressive. That's the question I got asked the most watching the main event, is like, how do I combat Nguyen, a player like Nguyen, where you just can't put them on a hand, right? What do I do against a player like that? And I think the answer is using a game theory approach and just playing hands that have a mathematical probability of being the best. And you do that in all situations. So if you, maybe a hypothetical situation that's a little extreme, but that'll help illustrate this, is to imagine you were playing against an emotionless robot. The only way to approach playing against an algorithm is to basically just play better than the algorithm. So the algorithm might bluff too often, he might be too aggressive, but let's say you set this computer program bot to be, you know, let's say you could set its aggression level, similar to how you could set an aggression level in a chess game, or the skill level. Let's say you set the aggression level at 9 for this robot, right? The way you would combat that robot is just to not fold often, to let it bluff, to trap it, and to just get to the river with hands that have showdown value, right? So you would also want to keep the pot small, because this thing, in a freeze-out situation like it is in a tournament, a heads-up, no limit hold'em in a tournament, you don't want to inflate the pot or play huge hands, because this thing is hyper-aggressive and you're going to increase your variance without a lot of security by combating aggression with aggression. So you want to be passive. You maybe want to limp buttons, you want to check back flops, you want to just get to the river with hands that beat it and let it bluff into you, and play a balanced style and just hang on, not fold when you have hands that are a mathematical probability to be the best. You don't want to get into the leveling game, you don't want to get into an emotional game, you don't want to get into a psychological game, just because you have no idea what this robot is thinking at any time. You have no idea what level he's on, you don't know if he's going to bluff, you don't know what the hell he's going to do. So the only way to beat it is just to play a more solid game, and in conjunction with a game that has less variance, because you only have one chance to beat the robot, right? So if you're playing the robot 100,000 times, maybe you could combat aggression with aggression, but at the same time, when you're running it once, like you are at the main event final table, you have to win. So winning becomes much more important. You want to lower your variance as much as possible to find the best possible spot. And so I think that's the approach that Veo should have taken, and I think I would have taken that approach as well. I would have probably started the heads-up match by raising like 10 buttons in a row and just seeing what happens. And if I noticed that Nguyen was never calling, I noticed that Nguyen was never 3-betting, I would continue to raise a little bit bigger to increase the pot in position. If he was 3-betting a ton, I might min raise. And if he was 3-betting too much, or just, you know, bombing it on flops too often, I would probably just limp with all my hands, maybe mix in some limp re-raises, depending on how often he raised after I limped, and then mainly just like limp, call, play flops in position with hands that have good showdown value, and maybe even like fold a little bit more percentage of my buttons than I would against another player, just because post flop it's going to be so difficult. So maybe I would limp with like 75% of hands, something like that, instead of like 90%, and just play flops in position. Like even limp with like a hand like Queen 10 and let him raise it up with a worse hand, let him flop like mid pair with a worse kicker, and let him just barrel 3 times on a bluff or overvalue his hands like he was doing a lot of the times. Nguyen would bluff and bet for value, both of those in spots where most players wouldn't. So I would just try and get to the pot, to the river, with hands that had more equity than his bluffing range or value betting range. I think that's the way to play, and I would have liked to see Veo do a little bit more of that. He tried to adjust to that in the end, but I still think he was a little bit too passive, maybe laying down a bit too much, not competing for enough equity, and maybe never, ever once bluffing. I think there were spots where he could have argued for a bluff or two that even if he got called, they still would have been good plays, because in the end, against a hyper-aggressive player that's going to force you to make a hand or force you to make a big play, eventually you have to make a big hand or a big play. If you're not making a big hand, you've got to take advantage of the spots that you could credibly represent something. And to Veo's credit, he built up this image for 3 days. I would have liked him to see you use it. Nguyen, on the other hand, could have been a little bit more passive. Like there were spots where, you know, his aggression worked, but in the long run, I think he made some decent negative EV plays, like the 4s hand, where he just called a raise out of the small blind and then back shoved all in against backs with 2 4s. Was just like, yes, he went for it, and yes, he ended up winning, but it's way too aggressive. It's bad from an ICM standpoint as well. You want to move up in pay jumps. You don't want to risk all your chips against the big stack. I understand he was sending a message. I understand it set the tone. I understand it ended up working, but I think long term, even in lieu of all those things, it's still a bad play. So I would have liked to see Nguyen, you know, not bluff in a few spots that he bluffed, and just show a little bit more patience and restraint, maybe like 20% less than he was doing. But overall, great play. Now, I think that Nguyen is a good ambassador for poker. Last 7-8 years, we had all under 30, like hoodied, headphone, professional type players win. I mean, a lot of them are good ambassadors, sure, but they're all the same type of ambassador, right? It's this under 30, like wizard, great online player type of pro. And I think that that's sort of demeaning for some recreational players that are just feeling like, shit, these guys must be so much better and they're so good, they're just crushing it, and you know, these guys are wizards, poker's kind of solved, you know, there's no place for recreational players anymore. So I think it's good to have a little bit of like a moneymaker effect, even though of course this will have no impact like moneymaker, but it's just good to have a completely different type of ambassador represent the main event. He's from Vietnam, Vietnamese background, so he has a different cultural heritage. You know, it's cool to see that as well, representing a different community. And it's also cool to see a different age group and just a non-classic professional with a completely different playing style end up winning. I think it's great that people like Martin Jacobson win as well, that are just like top of the line, world class, make 0 mistakes, absolutely crushing it, because it helps to showcase that there's a ton of skill in poker and skill and hard work pay off. But it's also good to have a little bit of balance to that, to say, hey, look, anybody could win, right? So it's good to have both, and I'm glad this year that from a poker perspective, right, not from a personal standpoint, just from what's best for the poker industry, I'm glad that Qui Nguyen won. I think he'll be a good ambassador. I like that he was doing something didactic, like giving some money back to charity. That's great for poker as well. And he seemed like a cool guy too. And so I'm proud of him. I'm happy he won. And I think he's going to be a good ambassador. He's going to be good for poker. And hopefully it brings hopefully it's a little bit of a marketing effect where people can see like, oh, this guy won the main event, I'm going to play next year, I'm going to try. And bringing recreational players into the poker industry is a good thing. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have comments, what you think about Qui Nguyen, what you think about the main event, leave them below this video. I would love to hear. And I'll be putting out more hand of the day videos featuring the biggest hands from the final table, along with the rest of my hands from day 7 of the main event that you could find on this channel as well. So stay subscribed. If you're not already, you're crazy, subscribe to the channel. Give it a thumbs up, and I appreciate it. I'll see you guys next time. Take it easy. Cheers.